the emergence of nations in Central Europe, World War I and after. And it's not a very happy story, unfortunately, especially when we talk about how national groups treat each other. I did want to review, last time we talked about this emergence of nationalism, and the two authors whom I should have mentioned and didn't, because there's people may have heard of them. The first is Henryk Sienkiewicz, probably more known in the United States for Quo Vadis because of this big movie from the 50s. But With Fire and Sword is the first of a historical trilogy. And if you want to really learn something about the way the Poles see their history, With Fire and Sword is really a good place to go. Sienkiewicz won the Nobel Prize in 1905. And another Polish novelist won the Nobel Prize in 1924 with a huge 4-volume set called The Peasants. Each volume is a season of the year. Again, if you have a lot of patience, you might want to look at those books. They're not hard to read, but they're long. We also mentioned Józef Piłsudski, who was seen as the father of the Polish Republic, mainly because he's really good at publicity. And he formed some armed groups to fight for Polish independence before the First World War. He initially sided with the Germans because he thought that they would deliver on an independent Poland. When he broke with them, they put him in jail. But after 19, he emerged as an important figure. And he's very much involved in this battle with the Russians, the so-called miracle on the Vistula, where the Russians are approaching Warsaw and are turned back. His vision of a Poland is opposite of that of Roman Dmowski, who wants to have a purely Polish society. And it's really a very intolerant, what some people have called integral nationalism. Józef Haller is a general who had his Blue Army, which was very effective in fighting off, well, there were several wars there, but Haller is in some ways a hero to Polish nationalists and a devil to Jews in particular, since his army was so much involved in the pogroms of 1918, 19, and 20. The World War I, before it comes to an end, the Germans take over Eastern Europe, and they mandate this so-called Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And if you look at this map, they just take over that whole pink area. They occupy the area. You see, when it's Ukraine. Here's right here. Is Ukraine, and the Germans, before they lost the war, showed what their war aims would have been had they won the war. That's why it's not so easy to take the complaints about how bad the Treaty of Versailles was. It's the inverse of what the Germans would have done. But that's the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. That's a place on there. We also mentioned Simon Petlura, who was a Ukrainian National Army hero, and he's still a hero. And we showed a picture last time of in 2005 of the Ukrainian president placing flowers on his grave. He was assassinated in 1927 by Shalom Schwarzbard, a young Yiddish writer whose parents had been killed in the pogroms. It was a sensational trial, and he actually was acquitted because he had committed a, quote, crime of passion. We mentioned the so-called dead Hasidim, that is, the Hasidim who no longer have a rabbi after Reb Nachman died. And they are part of a sort of a white Russian group of Hasidim. And then finally, we talked about the Treaty of Versailles, and I realized I had not spelled out the names of these national leaders. but Henri Clemenceau in France, Lord George in Great Britain, and Woodrow Wilson in the United States are the dominant figures in that treaty, which ends the First World War and sets up a state of Poland. Well, here's what Eastern Europe became. If you remember, before the war, you have the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is here, what I'm trying to outline with my cursor. We had the Russian Empire, which was here, including all these states. And we had the German Empire, which was over here. Now, all of a sudden, we get a whole series of states. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, these Baltic states. Poland, which is this old, if you recall, we call it the Congress Kingdom, plus Galicia, which is down here, plus these other parts which had been in Ukraine. And then Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, we don't have time to talk about them. But this is what Eastern Europe looked like between the two world wars. And it was not an easy time. First of all, we had this contested Lithuanian, Belarusian fatherland. Remember, we talked about the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which was sort of a great Polish state, starting with what's called the Union of Lublin and ending with the partitions of Poland. You know, they spoke, it's funny, they spoke Latin and then later Polish. And it's interesting that in the late 19th century, the Poles celebrate the Union of Lublin, and the Lithuanians saw it as a national disaster. Here is a painting by Jan Matejko, who's a painter who specialized in Polish historical themes. Here's this Union of Lublin, 1569, and King Sigismund II Augustus is the man holding the cross for this so-called Great Union. He was the last Jagiellonian king of Poland, as what's it called? The dynasty was called, and he presided over the Polish-Lithuanian Union. It's interesting, you know, when we say Poland, what do we mean? Generally, we define things by language. But a nobleman such as a Jagiellonian could be Lithuanian by origin, Polish in politics, and Russian or Greek, as they say, in religion. So, you know, it's hard to know what that was. It was not a national state in the way we think of one. And in 1795, when Poland completely ended, perhaps 80% of the peasants were uniates, which means Catholics following the Greek rite, but they still pay homage to the Pope. And we had Adam Mickiewicz, this great poet, and he's claimed by Poles, Lithuanians, and Belarusians. What is he? You know, you think he might have written in Polish, but the others see him as a national poet as well. Well, this is getting into what we're going to do today. There was an uprising in 1863, and the Russians really went about suppressing Polish intellectual life, you know, closing Polish schools, Polish universities. But there was a movement called positivism, which they said, we're going to create facts on the ground. We're going to create something here without government participation. And at the same time, you have Lithuanians and Belarusians waking up in a way that they had not woken up earlier. This is happening all over Europe. You know, it happened in Southern Europe. And often this involved protests against the dominant nationality. So in Russia, it's protests against the Russians. Among the Poles, of course, it's protests against the Russians. And we'll see that It's not so clear among the Poles in Galicia. That's a different story. But here's independent Poland. And we quoted this last week. Woodrow Wilson had these 14 points. An independent Polish state should be erected, which should include the territories inhabited by indisputably Polish populations, which should be assured a free and secure access to the sea, and whose political and economic independence and territorial integrity should be guaranteed by international covenants. Well, that was a great idea. I mean, why Poland should have been singled out was a success for Polish nationalists in the United States. It's the only country of these new countries that was singled out in the 14 points. But here's some issues. One is this so-called Polish corridor, because Poland need an outlet to the sea, and it splits Germany between this dark blue here and dark blue here. So you have a country in two parts with an independent city-state of Danzig. And this idea of indisputably Polish populations. Well, you get down here, this is Ukraine, it's Galicia. This is all Galicia down here, but it's got heavily Ukrainian population. So, Wilson's great ideals are not so great. There were Ukrainians at Versailles as well, but essentially they were ignored. They weren't the only groups that were not ignored, but they're among them. Ho Chi Minh was another one that was ignored. But so you have other claim. The Poles claim this territory up here, which is called Memel, and they actually in 1938, the Poles sent an ultimatum to Lithuania that you better accept the settlement at the end of the war, and we'll see that that settlement included the Polish occupation of the city of Vilna. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But what these countries got were something called minority treaties, where all of them were supposed to safeguard the rights of the minority populations. The first one was in Poland, and others were in other countries, but they weren't really supported. And there were a whole series of treaties after Versailles. I'm not going to go into the details, but just you ought to know that there was a treaty for Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. There was a treaty for Romania. There was a treaty for Greece, Bulgaria, Turkey. So we use the term Versailles, but it include a whole group of treaties. I mentioned that the Ukrainian representatives at Versailles got no attention paid to them at all. There were the minority treaties, and there were ongoing territorial disputes which involved Poland. There were others too. But here's this Polish corridor. Here's Memel up here. Here's the city of Vilnius or Vilna or Vilno, depending what language you're talking. Here's Chechnya down here, which the Poles grabbed from the Czechs were accused of grabbing from Poland. And we'll see the Poles try to get their own, and not a very happy situation later on. And Upper Silesia over here, where there was a contested plebiscite. So these things are not ended just because people signed treaties. Vilna in particular is a big issue for Poland. There are Poles in Vilna or Vilnius, again, depending what language you use. Vilna is Polish, Vilnius is Lithuanian. The Poles and Lithuanians argued about it. Lithuanians say it's our city. The Jews called it the Jerusalem of Lithuania, since it was a heavily populated by Jews. But Pilsudski and his Polish Socialist Party really wanted to have this part of Lithuania in the new Poland. He himself was born in Lithuania. And he talked about a federation, which would include Lithuania, Ukraine, and so on, as opposed to Dmowski, whose party was called National Democracy. They talked about language and religion, Polish and Roman Catholic. That's what, for them, defined being Poles. It's interesting that in Vilna, the Poles spoke a kind of fancy Polish, and they owned most of the land in the province. And by 1914, it was Dmowski whose ideas were predominant. That is, they wanted to just take over. The Poles were in charge, forget about the Lithuanians. So we have, as I say here, these two ideas of Polishness. One is the federation, one is this intolerant notion. The same thing goes with Lithuania. What exactly is Lithuania? You have nationalist versus multinationalist definitions. The city itself is a point of contention. You have Bolsheviks, you have Poles, Lithuanians, Belarusians, and all in a city with a large Jewish population. Until finally, 1920, the Poles used their army to take over. That remained a bone of contention for quite some time, well, until the Second World War. Let's see. Let's go on. I was looking at a chat. I'll come back to that. Sometimes this program doesn't obey orders. There we go. This is in Vilna. I can't make out all these signs, but there are signs in 5 languages. Here, this is Polish. This is Russian. This looks like Lithuanian. And presumably there's Yiddish and probably German somewhere. I can't read these signs, but it's an example of the kind of city that it is. 5 languages. Then there is a war between the Poles and the Bolsheviks. The Poles want to take Ukraine, and they drive to Kiev. And then they're driven out, and the Russians come back, and they come almost to Warsaw. This goes back and forth from 1919 to 1921. Until finally, you get this, well, one of the things is this Treaty of Riga, which I said 1921, I should say 1920. The Treaty of Riga sets the borders between Poland and the Soviet Union until 1939. So we get, once again, as I said, Vilna is Pilsudski's traditional patriotism versus Dmowski's ethnic nationalism. It's interesting that here, this is the Soviet Union, this light brown stuff. And this is the area in the Soviet Union which is called Belarus, White Russia. In the 1920s, Belarus was expanded. You have schools in Belarusian and other cultural institutions supporting that. All of this to be overturned in the 1930s when the Soviet Union engages on a suppression of nationalities. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes with regard to the Ukrainians in particular. But in Poland, the politics are dominated by the National Democrats. We have Vilna is occupied. And here's a picture of the Polish army celebrating the incorporation of the Vilna region. I'm sorry for the various spellings of this city. It depends where you go. But right now, the official name is Vilnius in Lithuanian. But the Poles had a different name, and Jews had a different name, and the Russians had a different name. They argued at this time, even then, of who owns Mickiewicz. You know, as I mentioned, Polish, Lithuanian, Belarusian. We had this expansion of Belarus that I mentioned a minute ago. In the meantime, expansion of the White Russians in the Soviet Union and Polish suppression of the White Russians. They closed their schools, they jailed their opponents. And this was a policy of intolerance by the Polish government against all its minorities, against the White Russians, against the Ukrainians, and against the Jews. Interwar Vilna, however, was occupied by the Poles. It's really quite a flowering of Jewish Yiddish culture in the 1920s and 30s, strangely enough, despite the government policy. But Lithuanian schools were forced to teach about, in Lithuania, not in Poland. In the area of Lithuania, which does not include Vilnius, which is right in here, the theme of the Lithuanian schools was often reconquering their traditional capital. And this is a little hard to read, but this is a person wandering, and he says he was going between two cities in Poland in 1934. Today, the first city is in Ukraine. The second one is in Belarus. And at the time, the photographer was in Poland. This is just something we're not used to here in the West. The Jews in Vilna, in interwar Poland, they seem to be pro-Lithuanian, according to the Poles. And part of this didn't prompt, but this helped a severe pogrom in Vilna in 1919. And the Poles deny that it ever took place. I mean, here's an example of a Mr. Reiter, who was killed by Polish legionnaires, probably Hitler's army that I mentioned, in 1919. And his death is emblematic for the Jews. It was picked up representing anti-Semitism and other challenges in the new Poland. The Jews went through what I might call three national revivals at the time. The first was Yiddish folk culture. If you look at, it was not a good situation in Poland for the Jews between the wars, but at the same time, you have a tremendous flowering of culture. I mean, there were, I've forgotten, in Warsaw alone in the 1930s, there were 11 daily Yiddish newspapers. In 1925 in Vilna, we have the founding of what's called YIVO, the Yiddish Scientific Institute, which managed some of the founders managed to escape from the Nazis and is now in New York. But it was a major research institution. And we get the rise of the Bund, which is a workers' party, socialist, but not a revolutionary Marxist party, becomes quite important for the Jews, particularly in self-defense. It's interesting, you don't see this, but my impression is most of their fighting was done with the communists, who were heavily Jewish. I'm trying to, there's a chat here. Let's see what that question is. Chava points out there was also a big center of Yiddish literature and research in Minsk in White Russia in the early Soviet period. Well, the whole notion of Jews in the Soviet Union is a big topic that I just don't have time to go into, but Chava points out that it's not just in Poland. This is from Yivo. I just give you this picture because some of these names are really still respected among Jewish scholars. This is Ilya Cherikover. I'm sorry, this is Cherikover. Simon Dubanoff is considered kind of the founder, really, of Jewish history writing. And Raphael Mahler writes a lot of stuff about Jews in Poland between the wars. The second trend among the Jews was that of Hebrew literacy. They even founded a series of Hebrew language schools. And this was tied, not inextricably, but tied with Zionism. There was a Zionist movement. And it's interesting how the actions of the Jews in this period reflected pre-World War I. So Zionism is very popular in the old Congress kingdom. But in Galicia, where there had not been the same kind of conflict, the Jews were not so interested in Zionism. They were initially very pro-Polish. And then the third trend here, I'm calling assimilation into Polish life, which starts off with adopting the Polish language. So assimilation doesn't necessarily, sorry, speaking Polish doesn't necessarily mean assimilation, but it means that you can fit in a way. So we have evidence that even among many of the youth of the 20s and 30s who were involved either in Zionist activities or in the Bund or whatever, grew up speaking Polish. That is, it is becoming for the urban groups a common language. And then I'm supposed to say, I said to myself, translate this. Oh yes, it's a Yiddish language school. The sign says we can all learn to read and to write. So in addition to those Hebrew schools that I mentioned, there's a series of Yiddish schools. And of course, there are the state-run schools where the majority of Jews go, at least until the 1930s, when they start getting pushed out of the high schools. This is something about how the Jewish population reacted to Poland. We have two great writers, Jacob Latstein, or Hebrew Jacob is Yaakov, and in Yiddish it's Yankov. And he's generally known as Yankov Glatstein, who died in 1971. And S.Y. Agnon, who won the Nobel Prize in the 1966, I think. You have a divergence of Yiddish and Hebrew, and there is this well-known conference in 1908 in the city of Chernovitz. Chernovitz is it's now in Romania. And there was this big fight, what is the language of the Jews? And the Yiddishists wanted to call it the language of the Jews, and the resolution following says it's a language of the Jews. But Yiddish becomes, in this notion, the language of, quote, diasporism, that is creating Jewish society outside of the countries they lived in. But it takes a while. Here's Glatstein, and here's this letter that he came to the United States, and the American Journal of Poetry sent a letter to Glatstein. Unfortunately, we cannot read your journal. We would, however, like to know what language it is printed in. Is it Chinese? This is like Rodney Dangerfield. Yiddish don't get no respect. Here is Gotstein, and the shit you see the second Y that's painted with an ocean liner in the background. But he makes the comment, how can I serve up exoticism for a Jewish audience that already knows the shtetl too tiresomely well? That is, they were all Eastern Europeans, I mean, a majority. So his poetry was not exotic, but it was very popular. But then in 1934, he goes back to Poland to visit his mother who was dying. And he says, and that's where you get this ship. I feel aboard the ship as Jonah must have felt in that first moment when he thought he had escaped God's wrath. But when he gets to Poland, he says, "See, I have never been false to you. My tongue may be cleaving to my gums, but I have never forgotten you, my Jewish Poland, with all your terrors and sorrowful festivities. Do not forget my right hand, as I have not forgotten thee." I assume this is familiar to many of you from Psalm 137, "If I forget thee, O Jerusalem," and he's using it here. It's very typical. People are used to using biblical language. On the other hand, we have a Hebrew writer, S.Y. Agnon, who won the Nobel Prize in 1966. And I've just mentioned here one of his more well-known novels, A Guest for the Night. I have to tell you, this stuff is not easy to read because he is so well versed in traditional Jewish literature, so that there are references to the Bible and to the Talmud that you would not necessarily catch. But he goes, here's a picture of Agnon. He goes back to Galicia. In the novel, he calls it Shibuch, which is, for most people, I assume, just as unpronounceable as his real city of Buchach. And he says, this is in the novel. He says, it's not an appointment with Poland, but an appointment with himself. It takes an ordinary man a quarter of an hour to walk to the center of town carrying baggage. And carrying baggage, it takes a quarter an hour more. I took an hour and a half. Every house, every ruin, every heap of rubbish caught my eye and held me. So this notion of the guest for the night, that's kind of, for many people, the ambiguity of Jewish settlements in Europe. And that could well stand for the Polish attitude to the Jews. They don't belong here. They are guests for the night. And as I say here, it's a quotation from the book of Jeremiah. But my own comment is, you can't go home again. And that, some of you may be familiar with Thomas Wolfe and his writings. Switching from the Jews to the Ukrainians. What's called the embattled Ukrainian borderland. I've underlined here these three, Volhynia, Podolia, and Galicia. Galicia is, of course, before the war in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and these other two areas are in Russia. And, you know, we have Ukrainian Orthodox peasants, but Uniates as well. This is where the Cossacks come alive, and the Cossacks are seen as the origins of the Ukrainian nationals. And I've mentioned several times Khmelnytsky and the Cossack uprisings of 1648. Later on, the right bank of the Ukraine, which is over here, is seized in the 18th century. And you have in these provinces over here, 10% Polish gentry, 10% Jews, and 80% Ukrainian peasants. And it's not a happy marriage. The Jews are considered by the Ukrainians as agents of the Poles, so very often they were, or the owners of inns, which was another Jewish occupation. In 1830, there was a defeat of the lower Polish nobility, and as I mentioned, 1863, the Poles were really suppressed. Meanwhile, you have the Ukraine and Russia. There was the Crimean War in 1856, and the Russians decree the Ukrainian language has not, does not, and cannot exist. I mean, and we've seen that languages become the source of nationalism. So we find, you know, Polish is still there, but Ukrainian becomes important. But if you look at Lviv or Lviv or Lemberg, whatever you want to call it, which is over here in Galicia, It was the seat of three separate Catholic rites. It was the Roman Catholic, the Greek Catholic, the Armenian Catholic, and lots of Jews there. I mean, it's this clash. So if you look at Galicia, and Galicia stays important even until 2021, as we'll see, this distinction there. In the western part, it's 88% Polish, 8% Jewish, but in the east, it's 65% Ukrainian, 22% Polish. I underlined here Galicia. Sorry, I didn't get that before, but there it is, Galicia here. Ukrainian nationalism was anti-Polish, despite this comment of the Russian authorities. And they have to think about what language and what church they're involved with. You've seen it, it's not clear. Well, now in the interwar period, we have Galicia and Volhynia at the margin. So in World War I, the Russians advance, and there's this big fortress at the city, I dare you to pronounce it, Przemysl. It's sort of, if we were to talk about World War I, you see how fortresses are on their way out because of weapons like this. You know, walls couldn't keep people out any longer. So in 1915, Przemysl fell, and to the Russians, but then the Germans take all of Galicia and Bukovina. Bukovina is further south. And in 1916, the Russians take Bukovina and part of Galicia. In 1917, the Russians are driven out. And if you recall, I showed you that copy of the book I translated about people whose farm was in Galicia. You can see what's happening to them. The armies are moving back and forth. And it's not just a matter of armies driving down the road nearby. Armies are always foraging for supplies, and they grab whatever they can get. And the peasants are really driven into poverty. Here's the war. Poles versus Ukrainians. It's such a vicious picture. I wanted to show you that. Here's the Polish eagle and the Ukrainian lion. And here you see Lvov as sort of a center of activity. And there's this war, 1917 to 1919. And what happens is that there are atrocities against each other. I mean, all of a sudden, it's not just a matter of armies. They start slaughtering people. So, you know, I've mentioned pogroms against the Jews, and that happened very frequently down there. But there are also attacks, Ukrainians attacking Poles and killing them, Poles attacking Ukrainians and killing everybody in sight. You know, human life takes on a lesser value. It's really frightening. Here is a painting of a pogrom in Lvov during the Polish-Ukrainian War. You know, in this case, these are soldiers going crazy with looted liquor. Well, what does it mean to be Ukrainian? It means one thing in Russia. It means something else in Galicia. In Russia, it's, you know, you may have loyalty to the Tsar. In Galicia, it means really being anti-Polish. And in Transcarpathia, which is a long section of Slovakia, you have people called the Lemkos, who the Ukrainians call Ukrainians, but they don't identify that way. You know, can't even figure out what the capital is. You know, today we think, oh, Ukraine, capital is Kiev. But, you know, there were people who saw this city with lots of names, Lvov, Lviv, Lemberg, Lemberg. Also considered it was a capital. That's the capital of Galicia, and Kiev is over on the Russian side. In the interwar settlement, you no longer have something called Galicia. The Ukrainians continued to talk about Halychina, which is Galicia. But if you look at Polish politics, and if you look at Jewish activity, Galicia really is different from other parts of Poland because of their experience in the pre-war period. And I would say in the 21st century, Galicia has a different kind of intolerant Polish nationalism from that of, I'm sorry, not Polish, but Ukrainian nationalism, different from that in the other parts of Ukraine. And we'll hope to get to that in the last lecture in this series. But in general, Poland is the enemy. This is a poster in Kiev in 1917. And the UNR is this independent Ukrainian army, which is really heroic for the Ukrainians and murderous for Poles and Jews. It says, our enemies will be destroyed by the morning. We will rule ourselves, brothers. We are in our own country. I'll try to read it in Ukrainian, although I know just a little Ukrainian, but it rhymes. Gnut nashi varizenki jak na sonsi, opanujemy mi bratia I swoi staronci. So here you have, and in the middle, this is a abbreviation of the Ukrainian National Army, UNR. You have to go section by section. If you go to Volhynia, here's Volhynia. This is the old Galicia here, at least the left part of it. And in Volhynia, you have 90% population. So this place is even more backward in a cultural sense and an industrial sense than further west. The urban population is Jewish. And in the interwar period, national democracy wants to drive the Ukrainians and Jews out and put Poles in their place. And this helps to make the Communist Party more popular because it's Communist Party here is anti-Polish. Just a picture of Rivne, the main city of Volhynia, and now it's Rivne in Ukraine. Ukraine in the Soviet Union. It's another national question here. This, let's take what they say. This green border, 1918, is the West Ukrainian People's Republic. They set themselves up during the war trying to be independent. And from 1917 to 21, you get this, see this purple line? This claimed boundary of the Ukrainian Republic of Kiev. And then under the Soviets, Ukraine is controlled by the party. It's not independent. But within the Soviet Union, you start with this green socialist republic. In 1939, remember that the Russians and the Germans divide Poland, so they stick this part into Ukraine. In 1940, they take these brown territories from Romania. In 1945, this is where what I call the Lemkos, this is where they lived from Slovakia. 1948, they got a little bit. In 1954, the Crimea is given to Ukraine. And what the map doesn't show, as you probably know, in 2014, the Russians grab it back. It's back in Russia. And it has strategic importance, this peninsula here. Ukrainian nationalism. World War I, there was an army of independence. Here's a picture of a man, Dmytro Vytovsky, the first commander of the Ukrainian Galician Army, 1918. And these people talk about Lviv, as a predominantly Polish city with a large Jewish minority, claimed as a Ukrainian capital. And it's just, this constant conflict. Ukraine, as I mentioned, gets no attention from the people who make the Versailles Treaty. They talk about Lviv. Here is from the Polish view, what they call the Lviv Iglitz, defense of the cemetery, because Lviv is in Poland between the two world wars. It's now in Ukraine. Another image of the Polish cavalry. We started off way back when with a picture of these winged hussars, and there is this tradition of the Polish cavalry. And they're pretty vicious at this period because this is still not a mechanized army. We have Galicia surviving as a concept in people's minds among the Poles, the Ukrainians, and the Jews. They all have a different idea of what this is, Galicia. We've talked about that a lot. I'm not going to spend time on that. In the Ukraine, this is what's important in the last few minutes. It's a tragic story. In the 1920s, the Soviet Union had something called korenizatsiya. Koren comes from the word for roots, growing one's own roots. And it encouraged in the 1920s cultural autonomy. It encouraged Ukrainian language. It encouraged Ukrainian schools. This is in the 20s. And then in 1928 comes the collectivization of agriculture, which is also a new program of Russification. Now, this is not from Ukraine, but I thought it was a great picture. It's from Uzbekistan. It says, strengthen working discipline in collective farms. And of those of you who know Uzbek, you can read that. I'm not sure we have too many Uzbekis here. And it's important to remember that this Uzbekistan is also involved in collectivization, as we'll see in a minute. But I wanted to show you at the time of collectivization how the government sort of says here you have poor peasants. You see this thatched roof cottage with very little else there. Middle income peasants, we see the notion is they have a barnyard, presuming there are going to be animals here, a larger family, they have a horse. And then we have the kulaks, the well-off peasants with not a thatched roof, but probably a metal roof of some sort. They own a wagon, they have animals. And the word kulak becomes a curse word in the Soviet propaganda machine. A kulak is anyone who's supposedly a well-off peasant, but eventually becomes a word for anybody who opposes what the government tries to do by force. And collectivization means take over the private farms. If you may know that one of the promises of the Soviet Revolution was land to the peasants, and they did break up a number of the large estates, but what happens is food becomes less available. The land is distributed in small strips. This is not something that's specific to Russia. But so peasants then start consuming 80% of what they grew. There isn't that much, there's a food problem in the country. Even in Ukraine, which is considered the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, that's a wheat field. Here's a farm taken somewhere in the period between the First World War. You see those thatched roofs, but this is probably a middle peasant from the pictures that we just saw. And then we get, in 1928, the establishment of a kolkhoz, which is a collective farm, or a sovkhoz, a state farm. And the peasants respond to this by, in many cases, slaughtering their livestock because they want to eat it. And the program is called off for about 1930 with something called Dizzy with Success. However, here is a Ukrainian word that probably should be part of your vocabulary, holodomor. It means a famine. Horrible pictures of this famine in 1932-33. It is, people dying on the sidewalks. I mean, just horrible. And the famine here in Ukraine is really, the darker it is, the worse the famine. And the accusation made, it's not an accusation. This is true. The government came and grabbed the grain to feed the cities. They took the seed grain so that they could not plant for the following season because they wanted it to feed the cities. There is a film, which is here in the library, called Mr. Jones, about a journalist, Gareth Jones, who goes to Ukraine. He goes to Russia and he sneaks to Ukraine and he documents what's going on. And it's forever to the shame of the New York Times that their correspondent in Moscow, whose name slipped out of my mind 1 second ago, won a Pulitzer Prize for saying how wonderful the Soviet government was treating all the peasants. And it was Jones who broke this story. Jones was later assassinated in the mid-30s. He was covering more stuff in Mongolia. But this is something that is etched into the Ukrainian national memory. Just as the Jews talk about the Holocaust, the Ukrainians talk about the Holodomor. And what the Ukrainians charge is that this was a genocide against the Ukrainian people, that it was organized in Moscow in order to wipe out this Ukrainian resistance, at least. And here you see a national memorial in Kiev, where the museum complex is flanked by two angels or keepers of the souls. Now, we have to say, was this genocide? Among Ukrainian historians and spokesmen, there's no doubt that that's what this was, an attempt to wipe out the Ukrainians. On the other hand, scholars in the West and other areas who do not deny this horrible famine also deny that it was genocide in the sense that it was anti-peasant and an attempt to feed the cities. We find large numbers of Russians and Kazakhs and Uzbeks who also died. That's why I mentioned that Uzbek sign a few minutes ago. So, and that is an ongoing historical controversy. If you look at the literature today, you can still see article after article about the genocide by the Russians, and writers in the West who say, well, it's not genocide, it's just a terrible policy by the Russian government. And that's where I'm going to end today's talk. Of this historical memory in Ukraine. We have just a few minutes if we have some questions. I don't see anything in the chats, but if you could either unmute yourself or throw a chat in if people want to ask something. These are charged times. The Ukrainians have not forgotten the 30s. The Jews have not forgotten the 1930s, and the Poles have their own interpretation, but it all is alive in historical memory. And unfortunately, some of these conflicts really play out in World War II, in the Holocaust against the Jews, in the destruction of other national communities, and that we'll deal with in the next class. Now, is that, I don't know whether that was a hand scratching a head or a question. If you have a question, go ahead and unmute yourself. Okay.
Well, let me just say, Larry, that just to sort of add to the litany of horrors, I know you sort of mentioned this, but I wanted to just reiterate and maybe I had to miss last week's class, so maybe you talked about it then, the absolute destitution and famine in the wake of World War I. I mean, you mentioned how the farms were destroyed and armies going back and forth. Were various Jewish ethnographic and other expeditions during that immediate post-war period, which were, and I'm sure this affected not just Jews, but the whole population, was the absolute desperate condition of people in the wake of World War I.
Yeah, well, this is true. In fact, that's where Herbert Hoover gets international recognition for organizing relief of the famine in Ukraine, regardless of nationality. And just for those interested in American history, although he had been known for other charitable work, that's what really catapulted him to national distinction in a horrible situation, as Chava is pointing out.
Larry, when you were talking about pogroms where Jews were attacked, and there's two other groups where there's Ukrainians and Poles, I can't remember which ones, against each other, and very bloody and ferocious. And it sort of struck me that in a way, the insurrection at the Capitol was almost like a pogrom, where they were there looking to kill specific people, looking to kill people. And it just struck me, that's all.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't, well, if you mean pogrom just by a crowd that kills everyone in sight, okay. But what happens in Central Europe, you're targeting specific national groups, whether you want to call politicians the object of that, could be. But it is what happens when violence becomes part of your society. It's an ugly development. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. You can go shovel your snow or not. Thankfully, we're here. We don't have to do it. And Chava will be presenting tomorrow in her series on holidays. I hope you can all make it. Thanks again for coming.